1. Antonio's father's funeral. The stormy day seemed fitting for Antonio's father's funeral, as if the heavens themselves mourned his passing. As the cemetery manager, it was my job to ensure everything went smoothly, even with the relentless downpour. The sky was an ominous shade of gray, and the wind howled through the trees, making the whole scene feel even more eerie. Antonio was a deeply spiritual man, and the grief in his eyes was heart-wrenching. I had seen many funerals, but something about this one felt different, almost foreboding. After the service, the mourners departed, leaving the cemetery desolate, and I began my routine of locking up, but the oppressive atmosphere made the task feel daunting. As I drove through the cemetery in the fading light, I noticed a figure walking among the tombstones. I honked my horn to get their attention, but they vanished behind a hedge. My heart pounded as I stepped out of the truck, gripping my umbrella tight. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind whipped it into my face, making it hard to see. I ventured into the storm, the cold rain soaking through my clothes and chilling me to the bone. For 20 minutes, I searched the rows of graves, calling out, but no one answered. The cemetery felt alive with shadows, each one seemingly moving just out of sight. The howling wind carried whispers that sent shivers down my spine. Finally, defeated and drenched, I returned to my office, convinced I had imagined the whole thing. Inside, I reviewed the CCTV footage, but it showed nothing unusual, only the storm battering the grounds. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I jumped from my chair, my heart racing. I called out, but the only response was the echo of my voice. The air felt thick with unease as I stepped into the lobby, scanning the room for any sign of the intruder. Then, through a window, I saw him. A man stood on the other side, staring at me with a blank, haunting expression. His clothes were soaked, his hair plastered to his head. What struck me most was his resemblance to Antonio's father. My breath caught in my throat as recognition set in. This was impossible. Antonio's father had been buried just hours ago. Panic surged through me, and I ran outside, calling for the man. The rain hammered down, and the wind howled louder, but he was gone. There was no trace of him, no footprints in the mud, nothing. I stood there drenched and trembling, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. Back inside, I locked up the office, my hands shaking. As I drove home, every shadow seemed to move, every gust of wind seemed to carry a whisper. I couldn't shake the image of the man's blank stare. That night, sleep eluded me, and the storm outside seemed to echo the turmoil within. To this day, I can't explain what I saw, but the memory of Antonio's father's apparition haunts me, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that linger beyond the grave. Story 2. Woman in White. One night, after a few too many drinks, Ryan, Mike, and I decided to do something daring. Let's explore the old cemetery, I suggested, my voice hoarse, hiding my growing excitement. Ryan, the designated driver, looked skeptical. Are you sure that's a good idea? Mike grinned, heading for the car. Come on, this will be fun. We arrived at the cemetery around midnight, the air thick with an ominous silence. Just enough moonlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting eerie shadows on the gravestones. I pulled out my phone to film, the dim light from the screen adding to the spooky atmosphere. As I panned the camera around, something caught my eye. Standing among the graves was a woman in a white dress with long gray hair, her head bowed. My breath caught in my throat. Guys, did you see that? I whispered, my voice shaking. Ryan and Mike turned to look, but the figure seemed to melt into the darkness. I'm just drunk. Ryan laughed nervously. No, she's right there, I insisted, pointing to where I'd seen her. But when I looked up from my phone, the woman was gone. A chill ran down my spine. We should go, Mike said, his earlier bravado fading. As I backed away, I stumbled, almost dropping my phone. My heart pounded as we hurried back to the car, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. Once inside, I locked the door and showed them the video. Look, I said, my hands shaking. The video clearly showed the woman slowly raising her head, revealing empty, lifeless eyes. She started to move toward the camera, her movements jerky and unnatural. Ryan gasped, his eyes wide with fear. Drive, Ryan, now, Mike yelled, his voice breaking. Ryan stepped on the gas and we sped away from the cemetery. As we drove down the dark, deserted road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I swear, she's real, I whispered, staring at the screen. I saw her. Ryan's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. Let's get out of here. We got to Ryan's house and sat in the driveway, the silence oppressive. I replayed the video, each time more terrifying than the last. The woman's eyes seemed to bore into my soul, her form growing clearer and more menacing. Suddenly, the temperature in the car dropped sharply, our breaths visible in the cold air. What? Mike muttered, rubbing his arms. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper filled the car, like a distant wind. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice shaking. Ryan nodded, his face pale. We need to go inside. As we entered Ryan's house, the feeling of claustrophobia persisted. We huddled in the living room, trying to make sense of what we had seen. Every creak and groan of the house made us tense. Maybe it's a joke, Mike suggested, though he didn't seem convinced. It's not a joke, I replied, clutching the phone. She's real. That night changed everything for me. I went from a skeptic to a firm believer in the paranormal, forever haunted by the memory of the woman in white. The fear and uncertainty of what we encountered in that cemetery still lingers, a chilling reminder that some things, the memory of her empty eyes and eerie presence remains etched in my mind, a haunting image I will never forget. Story 3. Creepy Cemetery Adventure. One humid summer night, my friend Sean had a wild idea. Let's explore that creepy cemetery on the edge of town, he suggested, his eyes gleaming with excitement. I hesitated. Are you sure? That place gives me the creeps. Come on, it'll be fun, Sean insisted, already heading to his car. We drove to the cemetery, its ancient tombstones barely visible in the dim moonlight. As we hopped the low, rusted fence, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut, like we were being watched. I don't like this, Sean, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Don't be such a chicken, he replied, though he sounded less certain now. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the cemetery, making us both jump. An older man emerged from the shadows, his face contorted with rage as he screamed at us. Fear surged through me, and we bolted, stumbling over graves and nearly tripping in our panic. This way, Sean yelled, leading us toward an old, abandoned building at the cemetery's edge. We ducked inside, panting. Sean shined his flashlight around, revealing a satanic sigil painted on the floor, surrounded by eerie dolls with button eyes. This place is so scary, he muttered, horrified. Before I could respond, the old man's screams grew louder. We need to go now, I urged. We dashed out, hearts pounding, but the man was right behind us, his footsteps echoing our own. Reaching Sean's car, we scrambled in, hands shaking. "Drive, Sean, drive," Holster shouted, looking over my shoulder. Sean fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. We sped away, the cemetery quickly disappearing in the rearview mirror. As we caught our breath, I broke the silence. "I don't know," Sean replied, his face pale. "But we're never going back there again." To this day, the memory of that night haunts me, a vivid reminder of the horrors that lurk in forgotten places. Story 4. Nighttime Cemetery Visit. On a chilly October night, my friend Jake and I decided to explore a massive old cemetery at 3 a.m. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the eerie atmosphere sent shivers down our spines as we wandered among the ancient. "Creepy, isn't it?" Jake muttered, his breath visible in the cold air. Suddenly, we heard a child's laughter, a high-pitched giggle that echoed through the graveyard. At first, we nervously laughed it off. "Just our imaginations," I said, but the laughter grew more disturbing, almost mocking us. Jake's face went pale as he pointed toward the wooded area. "Do you see that?" A shadowy figure stood there, barely visible among the trees. We tried to stay calm, but then we heard footsteps behind us, crunching through the fallen leaves. Terror gripped us, and we bolted, the sinister laughter following us, echoing in the darkness. "Run faster," Jake yelled, his voice trembling. We reached my car, only to find the back door mysteriously open. "Get in now," I shouted. We slammed the door shut and sped away, hearts pounding. As we drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figure chasing us. "What is it?" Jake gasped, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "But we're never coming back here again." We were convinced we had narrowly escaped something sinister, something not of this world. Story 5. Grandfather's Spirit. It was a somber July afternoon, heavy raindrops falling from the sky like tears as I stood alone by my grandfather's grave. The cemetery was quiet, a blanket of mist hovering over the rows of tombstones. My emotions were raw as I reflected on the memories of him, wishing he was still with us. As I looked up, my heart skipped a beat. 5 rows away, an elderly man stood staring at me. His features were hauntingly familiar, my grandfather's gentle eyes and weathered face. Shocked, I blinked hard, convinced it was a trick of the light. But when I opened my eyes again, he was gone, vanished into thin air. A shiver ran down my spine as I hurriedly left the cemetery, a strange sensation of being watched following me. The rain pounded against my car windows as I drove home, the wipers struggling to keep up. Suddenly, a deer darted in front of me, and I swerved, heart racing. Through the blur of raindrops, I glimpsed a figure on the roadside. It was my grandfather, standing eerily still, his eyes locked with mine. Panic surged through me, and I hit the accelerator, desperate to escape. That night, as I tried to calm my nerves, my phone rang. I stared at the screen. My grandfather's number. Heart pounding, I answered, but there was only silence on the other end. Fear gripped me as I realized he was trying to communicate with me from beyond the grave. The events of that day left me unsettled, questioning the boundaries between life and death. Was it a message from my grandfather, or my mind playing tricks on me? One thing was certain: the experience had changed me forever, leaving me haunted by the inexplicable encounter with my grandfather's spirit.